The morning Eli Whitfield turned 7, his father made him scrambled eggs with too much butter and forgot to buy the candles for the cake. And Eli told him it was okay and meant it, because at 7 years old, Eli understood, without being able to articulate the understanding, that his father was doing everything alone and that everything alone was a great deal for one man to carry. That had been 4 months ago. The eggs were still too buttery every time, and Eli still meant it every time he said it was okay. Dale Whitfield was not a complicated man. This was not a limitation. It was the clarity of someone who had looked at what the world offered and made a precise selection. His work, his son, the small house on Cutter Street, with the furnace that ran loud in October, the lunch he packed each morning in the same blue cooler he had owned for 9 years. He did not require more than this. He had required more once before Eli's mother left when Eli was 3, and the requiring had cost him in ways he did not discuss. So he had simplified, he had made the selection, and for 4 years the selection had held. He had worked the number 4 dock at Harwich Port Authority for 11 years. Harwich sat on the northeastern coast, a working port city that had never been pretty and had stopped pretending otherwise. Sometime in the 1980s, the kind of place where the smell of salt water and diesel fuel were so thoroughly combined that longtime residents had stopped distinguishing between them. The port was the city's central organ. Everything flowed through it or because of it. Dale had grown up in Harwich, left for 2 years after high school, returned because his father was sick, and then because his father was gone, and then because Harwich was simply where he was, and the port was where a man without a college degree and with a capacity for consistent, reliable physical labor could make a wage that covered the mortgage on Cutter Street and the 2 buttery eggs and the blue cooler and everything else the selection required. On the morning that would turn out to be the last ordinary morning, Dale was at the kitchen counter at 6:45 cracking eggs into the pan, and Eli was at the table with his shoes already on, because Eli had at 7 developed the habit of putting his shoes on first thing in the morning before breakfast, before anything, as if he understood that the day was something you needed to be ready for. "Where are you going tonight?" Eli said. Not accusatory, just asking. Dale turned the eggs. "Meeting with Cleet," he said. "Union business." "Can I come?" "You're going to sleep in the truck," Dale said. "Babysitter canceled." Eli considered this with the gravity of a child who takes logistics seriously. "Okay," he said. "I like the truck." Dale looked at him. Eli was eating now, fork in his left hand, the right one on the table with his fingers spread, which was a thing he did when he was thinking about something else. He was 7 and small for 7, and had Dale's coloring, the dark brown hair and the gray eyes that held more in them than a child's eyes were supposed to hold. He had his mother's chin. Dale had stopped noticing the chin most of the time. He noticed it now. He turned back to the eggs before Eli could see whatever was happening in his expression. The thing Dale had seen 3 weeks ago at the number 4 dock was not something he had gone looking for. He had been on an early shift, the 4 a.m. rotation that he picked up twice a month for the differential pay, and he had been moving along the secondary loading corridor at approximately 2:15 in the morning when the lights were on in the secondary bay and the bay door was open in a way that bay doors were not open at 2:15 in the morning. He had stopped. He had looked. The container was stenciled with the Vance Shipping logo, a stylized V, above the words Vance Maritime Logistics in block letters, one of perhaps 30 Vance containers that moved through Harwich's number 4 dock in any given week. It was open. The dock supervisor, a man named Greer, whom Dale had worked alongside for 6 years, was overseeing the unloading. What came out of the container was not the industrial components listed on the manifest Dale had reviewed 3 days prior as part of his shift documentation responsibilities. Dale had stood very still for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he had moved backward into the shadow of the adjacent corridor and stood there until the bay door closed again. Then he had gone back to his assigned section and finished his shift and driven home and made breakfast and taken Eli to school and come home and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall for a long time. He was not a naive man. He understood what he had seen. He understood what it meant for the container to contain what it contained and for the dock supervisor to be overseeing the transfer and for the whole operation to be running at 2:15 in the morning when the facility was supposed to be on reduced staffing. He understood the shape of it. He had grown up in Harwick. He knew who Conrad Vance was. Everyone in Harwick knew who Conrad Vance was. In the way that people in small port cities know who the significant man is, not because they have evidence of anything in particular, but because certain men carry a weight perceptible from a distance, a density that accumulates over years of being the kind of person who always comes out ahead. After 3 days of looking at the wall between shifts and between making dinner and between lying awake listening to the furnace run loud, in October, Dale went to a small electronics store on the north side of Harwick and bought a dashboard camera. The kind that clips to a visor, runs on a continuous loop, records in low light. He paid cash. He drove to the port on his next 4 a.m. shift and found a position for the camera where it could see the secondary loading bay without being visible from the bay itself, clipped into the gap behind a junction box in the outer corridor, angled through a ventilation gap in the partition wall. He had studied the partition for 2 weeks before he understood the angle worked. He recorded for 11 days. He collected the memory card each morning when he left his shift, transferred the relevant footage to his laptop at home, replaced the card. He tagged the timestamps. He watched what he had and understood that what he had was enough to matter. The question was what to do with it. The answer he arrived at after another week of the kitchen table and the wall was Cleet Odom. Cleet had been the Harwick Port Workers Union representative for 6 years. He was 51, a compact, careful man with a reputation for being scrupulously straight in a profession where that was not the universal standard. Dale had known him since Cleet's first year in the role, had served on a committee with him the previous winter, had formed the opinion of a person that develops over years of watching how they conduct themselves in small circumstances where no one is watching. He trusted Cleet the way he trusted the blue cooler, not sentimentally, empirically. He called Cleet on a Tuesday. He said he had something that needed to be handled correctly. Cleet said to come Friday to the dock office late when it was quiet. Dale said fine. He did not say what he had. He thought about saying it on the phone and decided against it. On Friday morning, he made the eggs. Eli put his shoes on before breakfast. Dale packed the blue cooler and stood at the counter and looked at his son eating the fork in the left hand. The right hand spread flat on the table, thinking about something. After Eli left for school, Dale sat at the kitchen table and got out a piece of paper and wrote his sister's name on it. Margaret Whitfield. Then her address in Chillicothe, Ohio. Then her phone number, which he had not dialed in 14 months, which he was going to dial tonight after this was done, and everything was going to be fine. He folded the paper around the insurance document he had printed 3 days earlier and put it in an envelope and wrote Margaret's name on the outside and placed it in the storage compartment in the center console of the truck, under the registration and the owner's manual, where it would be found if someone was looking but not immediately visible. He almost took the envelope out again. He almost threw it away. He thought about what throwing it away would mean, about the arithmetic of risk that he had been running in his head for 3 weeks, and he left the envelope where it was. He picked Eli up from school at 3. They stopped for gas. Eli wanted a candy bar from the station, and Dale said one, and Eli selected with the thoroughness of a person for whom the choice mattered. They drove home. Dale made dinner pasta with the jarred sauce Eli preferred over the kind Dale made from scratch. They watched television for an hour. Dale helped with the reading homework, 2 pages from a chapter book about a dog and a boy, and Eli read slowly and carefully and got every word right. At 9 o'clock, Dale told Eli it was time. Eli got his jacket, the one with the hood dark green, slightly too big, which Dale had bought that way on purpose, so it would last the winter and the next one. Eli put it on over his pajamas because Dale had told him he was going to sleep in the truck, and Eli had decided that meant pajamas were acceptable. They drove to the port in the dark, the rain starting just before they hit the access road. The October rain that comes in cold off the water before it decides to be winter, that comes sideways when the wind picks up. Dale parked in the lot adjacent to the dock office building where the truck staged. He left the engine off. He cracked the window slightly on the passenger side, the way he always did when Eli was in the car, because Eli had told him once that closed windows made him feel like the air was being used up. He took his jacket off. His dock jacket, the heavy one, the one with the inside pocket where the memory card was. He thought about keeping it. He thought about the envelope in the center console and the arithmetic he had been running, and he laid the jacket carefully across the back of the passenger seat where Eli was already leaning against the window with his eyes closing. The memory card was in the inside pocket. If anything went wrong, which it was not going to, but if it did, the card would be here, with Eli. And Eli would know what to do or would find someone who did. He was not being pessimistic. He was being a father. He got out of the truck and walked toward the dock office through the rain. And he did not look back because looking back was the kind of thing that made you change your mind. And he had made his mind up 3 weeks ago when he stood in the shadow of the corridor and watched what came out of that container and understood what it was going to cost somebody to do the right thing and decided that he was going to be the somebody. Eli woke to the sound of voices. Not words, just the register of voices, the rise and fall of an exchange outside filtered through rain on glass, through the half-awake state of a child surfacing slowly from sleep, not yet understanding what is real. He was 7. He had been dreaming about the dog from the chapter book. Then another sound. Not a voice. His eyes opened. The window beside him was fogged with his breath, and the rain was heavier now, running in sheets and through the water on the glass, and the dock's perimeter lighting. Eli could see the concrete of the loading area, and 2 figures, and then a third figure he recognized by the jacket. The heavy dock jacket, dark green, the same color as his own hooded jacket, the one he wore because it matched his father's. He sat up. He pressed his face to the glass. He saw Chief Bud Harmon. He had seen Harmon before. The chief appeared at things in Harwick the 4th of July, the Port Authority's annual safety presentation that Dale had brought Eli to twice, and he had the kind of face Eli associated with men who ran things heavy and settled the face of someone who has given orders so long that giving them has become the natural position of his features. Harmon was not in his cruiser. He was not in uniform. He was in dark civilian clothes. He was not alone. Eli saw what happened next. He was 7 years old, and he understood it completely the way children understand the things adults most wish they would not, with a clarity that has not yet built the protective distance adults use to make the unbearable slightly more bearable. He understood without euphemism. He understood with his entire body, which went cold from the outside in, starting with his hands pressed against the glass. His father did not fall immediately. That was the part Eli would carry longer than anything else about that night, longer than the cold of the drainage pipe, or the rain, or the 40 minutes of running. The moment before his father still standing in the dock's perimeter light, the rain coming down on the dark green jacket that matched Eli's, and then the moment after, which was different in a way that 7 years old was entirely sufficient to understand could not be undone. Eli did not scream. Later, he would not be able to explain why. Something had happened in him in those seconds that was past screaming on the other side of it, a place where the body stops making noise because making noise belongs to situations that are not yet this bad. He sat in the truck seat for 3 seconds, maybe 5. He was counting without intending to the way the brain counts things during shock as something to occupy itself. Then he reached for the jacket on the back seat, his father's jacket. He pulled it into the front seat with him and found the inside pocket, the one his father always used where important things went. He had watched his father put things in that pocket his whole life. His fingers found the card immediately, a thin rectangle of plastic no larger than his thumbnail. He looked at it. Then he took his right shoe off and peeled back the insole the way he had seen his father do once with money at a gas station when the card reader was broken, and he pressed the card flat against the base of the shoe and replaced the insole over it and put the shoe back on. He did not think about why he did this. The thinking was not available to him. There was only the sequence, one thing and then the next, the shoe, the insole, the card, the laces. Then he opened the truck door and ran. The drainage pipe was 3 feet in diameter and ran beneath the access road coming out on the other side in an alley behind the port's maintenance building. Eli found it because he had been to the port enough times to know the property in the approximate way children know places they visit repeatedly, not in detail but in shape. And the shape of the port included the drainage channel along the eastern fence and the pipe that went under the road. He was wet through before he reached it. He went through on his hands and knees in 6 inches of cold water and came out in the alley and ran. He ran without direction for the first minutes, which was the right instinct, because direction would have required knowing where he was going. And he did not know where he was going. He only knew that he was going, that the going was the entire content of the present moment. The rain was cold and the alley was dark and his shoes were soaked, the right one, with the card pressed flat under the insole. And his jacket was too big and the hood had fallen back and the rain was in his hair and on his face. He ran for 40 minutes. He knew it was 40 minutes because he looked at the watch his father had put on his wrist that morning, the simple digital watch Dale wore for work and had strapped onto Eli's wrist as a kind of ceremony. You're old enough for a watch now, and the watch said 11:20 when he stopped running, 40 minutes after 10:40 when he had looked at the truck's dashboard clock before everything changed, before the world had been the world he knew. He stopped because the lights appeared. At the end of the street, at the far end of a block of dark storefronts in the Harwick darkness that settled over the commercial district, after 9 there was a building with lights. Not the cold blue of security lighting, warm light from windows, the kind that meant people inside. And music muffled through walls, and beneath the music the low, steady register of engines and voices. Eli stood on the sidewalk in the rain and looked at the building. There was a hand-painted sign above the door he could not fully read from this distance, but which included a word he recognized from the backs of the jackets of men who sometimes came through the port, Ironwood, in heavy letters. There were motorcycles in the parking lot. Many of them. The building was occupied by the kind of people most adults in Eli's life would have told him to run away from if any of those adults were here. They were not here. He walked to the door and opened it. The music stopped. Not gradually. All at once, as if someone had pulled a plug, which someone had. 50 men in leather and chains and boot heels and rings turned toward the door and looked at a 7-year-old boy standing in it, soaked through with blood on his jacket that was not his blood, with eyes that had cried themselves empty and kept going. Eli looked at all of them and did not run. This single fact, his not running when running, was what any reasonable 7-year-old would do, communicated something to the man at the bar that the man registered before language caught up to it. The man came around the bar. He was large in the way some men are large, not because of size alone, but because of how they occupy space, as if the space recognizes them and adjusts. His hands, when he came down on one knee in front of Eli, so their faces were level, were broad and scarred and heavy with rings. He placed them on Eli's shoulders, the way you place your hands on something you are not gripping, but are simply being present with. Carefully, without pressure. "Hey," he said. His voice was low. "Hey, you're inside now. You hear me? You're inside." Eli's hands came up. He grabbed the front of the man's leather-cut both fists the way you grab when you have found the thing you have been running toward and are not certain you will be allowed to keep it. "Don't call the police," Eli said. "Please, they work with the bad men." The man did not move. He did not look at the room. He looked at Eli with the steady eyes of someone who has heard a great many things in his life and is deciding in real time what this one requires of him. "Nobody's calling anybody," he said. "Not yet." He held Eli's gaze, not rushing, not calculating, or if calculating, doing it somewhere below the surface where Eli could not see it. "What's your name?" Eli said. "Eli Whitfield." "Okay. Eli Whitfield. I'm Harlan. You're going to tell me everything." He looked over his shoulder at the nearest man. "Towel and water, and somebody find Doc Reeves." He looked back at Eli. He did not suggest letting go of the jacket. "Start from the beginning," Harlan said. "Take your time. We're not going anywhere." Harlan Cole had been tending bar at the Ironwood Chapter's clubhouse for 12 years, which meant he had been the first person to hear a great many things that people brought through that door when they had nowhere else to bring them. He had a capacity for stillness when stillness was needed, and a capacity for movement when that was needed instead, and he had over time developed a reliable sense for which the moment required. He was 44 years old, built for the work his life had given him, with hands that showed the history of that work, and eyes that had arrived through the accumulation of things seen at a deliberate calm that was the opposite of detachment. He listened to Eli Whitfield tell him everything. It took 11 minutes. He knew because he was watching the clock behind the bar with the part of his attention he kept separate from the listening. Not because the time mattered, but because he was already thinking about what came next. And what came next required knowing how much of the night was left. Eli told it the way a 7-year-old tells a true story without rhetorical structure, in the order it happened with the details children retain: the too big jacket, the matching green, the watch his father had given him that morning, the drainage pipe that was cold and had 6 inches of water in it. He did not editorialize. He simply said what happened and looked at Harlan while he said it, and Harlan listened with the entirety of his attention. When Eli was done, he reached down and untied his right shoe. He peeled back the insole. The memory card was there dry, a rectangle of black plastic, no larger than a thumbnail, because it had been against the warmth of his foot through the drainage pipe, and 40 minutes of rain, and the warmth had kept it dry. He held it out to Harlan. Harlan took it with the same care he had used to place his hands on the boy's shoulders. He looked at it, then he looked at Eli. "Your dad put this somewhere you'd find it," Harlan said. "He left his jacket on the seat," Eli said. "He always keeps things in that inside pocket." Harlan looked at the card again. He stood and turned to face the room which had in the preceding 11 minutes arranged itself in the configuration of men who are waiting for information and know better than to ask for it before it is ready to be given. Rex Dunbar was at the back of the room. He had been there since minute 3 of Eli's account, when something in Harlan's posture had made him stop his conversation and give the situation his full attention. He was 54, silver-haired, built with the density of a man who has never confused size with effectiveness, missing the use of his left eye from a circumstance 15 years ago that he did not discuss. He crossed the room. Harlan told him the short version in 45 seconds. Rex listened without interrupting. He looked at Eli, who was holding the towel someone had brought and had the mug of warm cocoa between his hands, and was watching both of them with the steady gray eyes that held more than a child's eyes were supposed to hold. Rex looked at the memory card. He looked at Harlan. "Sounds like a Vance operation," Rex said. "The number 4 doc. Been running a while from what the boy described." "Who'd he go to?" "Cleet Odom." Rex was quiet for a moment. "Cleet's straight," he said. "But Cleet's connected to the port, and the port connects to Vance. And somewhere in that connection, something broke tonight." Harlan nodded. He was already thinking past it. The sirens came through the walls before either of them finished the thought. Not the random sound of distant emergency traffic. The specific warble of vehicles approaching with purpose, decelerating toward a destination that was this building. 2 sets, getting louder. Rex looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at Eli. "Get him to the back," Rex said. "Medical room." Low and quiet. Harlan picked Eli up, simply lifted him one arm the way you move a child when there is no time for any other arrangement, and walked toward the back of the clubhouse. Eli did not resist. He put his arms around Harlan's neck and held on with what was left of his strength, which was not much, but was sufficient. The medical room had a good lock and a cot with a wool blanket and a first aid cabinet that had seen considerable use. Harlan set Eli on the cot and crouched to his level. "Stay low," he said. "Stay quiet. Whatever you hear, you wait for me. Nobody comes through this door except me or Rex." "You understand?" Eli nodded. Harlan held his gaze for a moment. Then he stood and went back to the front of the building. Outside, Chief Bud Harmon's amplified voice came through the walls with the confidence of a man who has never stood before a door that did not eventually open for him. "Attention inside. This is Chief Harmon, Harwick Police Department. We have reason to believe you are harboring a juvenile subject wanted in connection with a theft incident at the port facility. Surrender the individual immediately or face charges of obstruction and harboring a fugitive." Harlan was at the front door before the sentence finished. He opened it and came down the porch steps. Harmon was at the bottom in a rain-dark uniform, 4 officers behind him, 2 patrol cruisers turning the wet parking lot red and blue. He was 52, heavy at the jaw, in the middle with the face of someone who has given orders so long he has forgotten what it costs. He reached for his badge when he saw Harlan, the automatic gesture of someone deploying an argument that has always been sufficient. I need, he started. What happened next was fast enough that the men watching from the doorway and along the porch railing would disagree afterward about the sequence, whether Harmon got the badge fully out, whether his second word was finished. What they agreed on was the sound, which was substantial, and the result, which was Harmon sitting on the wet gravel of the parking lot with both hands over his face while his badge lay in a puddle 6 feet from his right hand. Harlan picked up the badge. He walked to where Harmon was sitting and crouched and pressed the badge back into the man's hands with 2 fingers firmly, the way you press something into a place where you need it to stay. Then he stood and looked at the 4 officers. They looked at the 50 men in the doorway and along the railing. They looked at Harlan. They made the calculation the situation required. Your chief, Harlan said to all 4 of them, killed a man tonight at the number 4 dock. The man's name was Dale Whitfield. He had a 7-year-old son. He let that sit for a moment. I'd think very carefully, he said, about whose orders you take next. He walked up the porch steps and through the door and closed it behind him. In the medical room, Eli Whitfield sat on the cot with the wool blanket around his shoulders and the mug cooling between his hands. He listened to the building, the low murmur of the men outside the door, the settling of the old structure in the rain, the distant sound of the patrol cruisers making the calculation Harlan had suggested and arriving at the right answer. He was 7 years old. His father had given him a watch that morning. The watch said 11:58. He looked at his right shoe where the insole lay flat over the space where the card had been. His father had always kept things in that inside pocket. Things he needed to be certain of. Things that mattered. Eli had known exactly where to find it. He pulled the blanket tighter and waited for Harlan to come back, which Harlan had said he would, and which Eli believed because Harlan was the kind of man whose word carried the weight of who he was. And Eli, at 7 years old, wearing his father's watch on his wrist and his father's memory in his right shoe, was already sufficient judge of men to know the difference. Nora Caffrey drove with both hands on the wheel and the heat off because she did not trust herself to stay sharp in a warm car at 12:30 in the morning, and staying sharp was what the next several hours required. Rex had called her 22 minutes ago. She had been asleep for 40 minutes, which meant she had not been fully asleep, which meant she was already running on the accumulated debt of a week that had asked too much of the hours between midnight and 5. She had dressed in the dark, grabbed the laptop bag from the chair where she always left it, the hard drive from the shelf above the desk, and been out the door in under 4 minutes. Rex had told her 3 things on the phone. A boy, the number 4 dock, Harmon. She had not needed more than that. She had been building the map of Conrad Vance's operation for 6 weeks at Rex's request, following a situation that had touched one of the chapter's associates in a way that had no clean explanation unless Vance's port operations were considerably more than they appeared. She had been a financial crimes attorney for 7 years before she left the firm, and she understood the architecture of concealment the way a structural engineer understands buildings, not by looking at the surface, but by understanding what the surface is built to hide. She had been 6 weeks into the map when Rex called tonight. She had not finished it. She was going to finish it now. She parked at the back of the clubhouse and knocked twice, and the door opened, and the first thing she saw was Harlan Cole standing in the hallway outside a closed door with his arms at his sides and the expression of a man who has made a decision about what the next several hours require and has made his peace with it, not with serenity, but with the settled quality of something that is done. The second thing she saw when Rex opened the door to the medical room was the boy. He was on the cot with the wool blanket and the mug, and he was fully awake with gray eyes that tracked her immediately when she came through the door. She had expected a child in shock, the flat effect, the vacancy of a mind that has taken on more than it can hold and has shut down the parts it does not immediately need. She had not expected this. This was a child who was processing, who was watching her the way she watched things she needed to understand. She set her bag on the table. She sat down across from him. She did not introduce herself immediately. She looked at him the way she would look at a document she needed to read correctly. Your dad worked the number 4 dock, she said. 11 years, Eli said. And he left you something tonight, before he went inside. He brought his jacket, Eli said. He left it in the truck. The card was in the inside pocket. He always keeps things there. Nora looked at Rex, who placed the memory card on the table in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked at the boy again. Can you make it so what my dad did matters, Eli said. It was not quite a question. It was said with the flatness of someone who has already decided to ask it and is past the part where asking feels like vulnerability. Nora held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said. Then she opened her laptop. The footage loaded at 12:47. Nora had brought a card reader because she had brought everything, because this was the kind of night where you brought everything and sorted out what you needed when you got there. The card read cleanly on the first attempt. 47 minutes of footage. 3 recording sessions across 11 days. The timestamp data was intact. The file structure was clean. Dale Whitfield had been methodical without excess, each thing in its place. The first session, 21 minutes, the secondary loading bay, 2 in the morning. The Vance shipping container, the logo clear under the dock's security lighting. Greer, the dock supervisor, directing. Faces visible. 3 vehicles with plates. Nora began logging, immediately cross-referencing against the corporate structure she had been building for 6 weeks. 2 plates returned to shell entities already in her map. The second session, 14 minutes, 9 days later. Different shift, different angle. Dale had repositioned the camera. He had noticed something in the first session that made him adjust some aspect of the coverage he had corrected with the patience of someone who understood the work needed to be done correctly or not at all. This session caught 2 faces she did not have yet. She tagged them. Then she saw something that made her stop. She backed the footage up 18 seconds and watched it again. At the edge of the frame, partially occluded by the corner of a shipping container, a figure. Standing. Not working, not directing. Standing in the way that men who own things stand when they are observing what they own. The dock's security lighting caught the right side of his face, and the line of his jaw, and the gesture he made with his right hand when he spoke to the man beside him. A specific motion, a slight backward tilt of the wrist before the index finger pointed. A mannerism she had seen twice in archived footage of Conrad Vance at a Port Authority hearing 3 years ago, and once in a deposition video obtained through a federal courthouse contact. Dale Whitfield had not known he recorded this. He had been covering the container and the workers in the vehicles. He had not known that Conrad Vance himself was standing at the edge of the frame for 4 minutes and 37 seconds, clearly identifiable to anyone who had spent 6 weeks building a map of the man's operations and had studied every piece of public footage that existed. Nora tagged the timestamp. She took 3 screen captures at different frames. She said nothing. She kept going. The third session was 12 minutes. The dock office exterior, the secondary lot, 11:45 at night. Dale's vehicle was in the frame, which meant he had repositioned the camera to the exterior before going in, which meant he had known something about tonight that made him cautious in a way the previous sessions had not required. He had been planning documentation even for the meeting, even for the thing he trusted. Dale entering the dock office. 4 minutes of nothing. Rain on the exterior of the building. The dock's perimeter lighting a container truck moving through the main gate in the background. Then Chief Bud Harmon's black Tahoe arriving in the secondary lot. Harmon getting out. Not in his cruiser. Not in uniform. Dark civilian clothes. The choice of someone who understood that what he was about to do was not an official function. Nora watched the next 2 minutes and 30 seconds without moving. When it was over, she did not play it again immediately. She sat with it for a moment. In the room, Eli was very still on the cot. He had been watching her face, not the screen throughout. She was aware of this. She looked at him. "Your dad," she said. He was very careful. Every session. He did this correctly. Eli said nothing. He looked at her and waited. She looked at Harlan in the doorway. He had watched the final segment from there. His expression had not changed, but his stillness had become a different kind of stillness, the kind that means something is being decided at a level below the surface. I need 47 minutes, Nora said. What happens in 47 minutes? Rex said. She looked at him. Everything she said. She went back to the footage. She played the Vance segment again, then the Harmon segment. Then she began building the distribution package. 47 minutes was not an arbitrary number. It was the minimum time required to do this correctly. Correctly meant what she sent could not be dismissed, could not be filed and lost, could not be treated as the unsupported allegation of an anonymous source. It had to arrive as a complete evidentiary package, organized in the format that federal case teams use when they want material to be immediately actionable, with timestamps tagged and corporate documentation attached and relevant prior records included, so that whoever received it could understand the shape of the entire operation within 10 minutes of opening it. She worked in the order she had planned. The footage first tagged and timestamped with screen captures of Vance at the marked frame. Then the corporate structure, the documents she had been building for 6 weeks, the Vance Maritime Logistics Holding Company, the 3 shell entities beneath it registered in Delaware, the beneficial ownership chain running through a Luxembourg vehicle to a Cyprus account before reaching anything traceable to a human name. She had not completed the chain when Rex first called. She completed it now, the last 2 links falling into place with the satisfaction of a thing you have been building toward that finally closes. She attached the financial records. Prior shipping manifest from the number 4 dock cross-referenced against the container logs, showing the pattern of discrepancy between documented cargo and actual transfer tonnage across 14 months. The 2 plate returns that matched her shell entities. The Congressional Oversight Report on Maritime Freight Irregularities from the previous year that named Harwich Port Authority as one of 6 facilities under preliminary examination. She built the distribution list. 7 federal contacts, the DOJ Financial Crimes Division, the FBI Field Office with maritime jurisdiction, the specific task force she knew from public records had been investigating East Coast freight operations for the past 14 months. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the district and 3 senior staffers on the Senate Oversight Committee, whose official contact information was technically public. 7 media contacts, not local outlets, which had the vulnerability of operating in a city where the police chief and the port's largest employer were the same corrupt ecosystem, but national desks with the resources and the independence to move without fear. 14 contacts, 14 separate transmission paths. The redundancy was the point. At the 31-minute mark, she stopped. She looked at the boy. Eli was sitting exactly as he had been when she came in, the blanket around his shoulders, the mug between his hands. He had not slept. He had not asked anything since the single question at the beginning. He had been present, watching in the way children are present when they understand something important is happening, and their role is to witness it. She said his name. He looked at her. "The footage you brought tonight," she said, "it has your dad on it. The last session. You don't have to watch it. I need you to know it's there and that it shows what happened clearly. And I need you to know that it's going to matter. Not in the way you want it to matter tonight. There is no way to make tonight different. But in every way that exists after tonight, it is going to matter. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Eli was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the mug. He looked up. "He recorded it so someone would know," Eli said. "Yes," Nora said. "Then it worked. Even though he didn't make it out." Nora held very still. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." Eli nodded once with the gravity of a child who has arrived at a truth too large for his age and has decided to carry it anyway. She went back to the laptop. At 38 minutes, Harlan appeared at the doorway again. He and Rex exchanged something in the shorthand of men who have worked alongside each other long enough that full sentences are sometimes unnecessary. Rex left the room. Harlan stayed in the doorway. She was aware of what was happening on the other side of the clubhouse walls. The motorcycle engine starting up intermittently for the past 20 minutes, the parking lot filling and organizing, the low, steady sound of Rex's voice in the main room, delivering information that the chapter's 5 affiliate road captains needed to receive. She did not need to hear the words. She had delivered her part to Rex at the 20-minute mark, the elements he needed. The dock layout from the Port Authority's public engineering filings, the contractor security operation that Vance Shipping employed the estimated personnel count based on the facility's size and the scale of the operation. She had also spent those 20 minutes building something else, something she had started in the 40 minutes between Rex's call and leaving her apartment, working from what she knew of the security vendor Vance used, which she knew because the vendor's contract was a line item in the shell company financials she had been mapping for 6 weeks. An intrusion into Vance's contractor communication network, not a shutdown. Targeted degradation, reducing the network's functionality to approximately 40% of operational capacity, enough to hear, but not enough to coordinate, enough to transmit, but not enough to be certain the transmission had been received. She had set it to activate on a delayed trigger at the 4 a.m. window. She had calculated when Rex described the dock layout, giving the system time to propagate through the contractor network before it was needed. She had been a financial crimes attorney for 7 years. She had understood going in that the law is the beginning of justice and not the whole of it. And there are circumstances in which the beginning requires someone else to create the conditions for it to function. She had made her peace with what the next several hours contained. She had made it 6 weeks ago when she understood what the map was showing her. At 43 minutes, the package was complete. She read it through once, beginning to end, for errors of omission and errors of sequence and errors of emphasis, the 3 categories that get things buried. She found 2 adjustments and made them. At 44 minutes, she sent it. 14 transmissions simultaneous, completed in under 3 seconds. The package was in 14 inboxes. It could not be recalled. It could not be intercepted at this end. It existed now in the world independently of the card, independently of her, independently of anything that happened to the original footage in the next several hours. She closed the transmission window. Eli was watching her. "Did you send it?" he said. "Every last file," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. He nodded. He looked down at the mug in his hands, which had gone cold. He looked at the watch on his wrist. He looked at the door. He closed his eyes. It was the first time he had closed them since she arrived. In 6 minutes, 3 of the 14 recipients replied. In 12 minutes, a wire service carried the first story under a breaking news designation. Nora watched this on her phone with the attention of someone who has set a thing in motion and is monitoring its physics. In 20 minutes, Vance Shipping stock began moving in the direction that reflects a market's rapid reassessment of a company's legal exposure when that exposure has been documented and distributed to 14 parties simultaneously at 1:27 in the morning. She set her phone face down on the table and looked at Harlan. "The financial side is done," she said. "He's going to know within the hour. When he knows, he's going to try to move the dock operation. Clear the evidence, move the people, destroy the physical records." She paused. "He'll call whatever Port Authority contacts he still has. They'll try to have the dock cleared by morning." "How long does he have?" Harlan said. 4 to 6 hours, Nora said. "If the task force moves at the speed they're capable of. If they don't," she looked at him directly, "that's your window." Harlan nodded. He had been operating on the assumption of the window since minute 6 of Eli's account, when the shape of the night had become clear enough to plan around. He had been building toward it the entire time she had been sitting at this table. He picked up the radio from the door frame and keyed it once. The sound from the parking lot changed. Nora looked at the boy, who had not reopened his eyes. His breathing had slowed to the rhythm of someone at the edge of sleep, the mug still between his hands, the blanket around his shoulders, the watch his father had given him that morning showing 1:31. She thought about Dale Whitfield, who had spent 11 days recording in the dark in the early hours before the port came alive, repositioning his camera, checking his timestamps, carrying the card home each morning in the inside pocket of his dock jacket. Who had driven to this meeting tonight with a 7-year-old asleep in the passenger seat and left his jacket in the car before going in where the card was, where Eli would find it? She thought about what kind of man plans for the worst outcome with that precision while still walking through the door anyway, while still believing the truth was worth the cost of delivering it. She closed her laptop and began preparing what Rex's contact at the federal task force would need to know when she called him at 4 in the morning. Outside the clubhouse walls, the sound of the engines was no longer intermittent. It was continuous building, the way large things build not through addition, but through transformation. Each new voice changing the character of the whole until it was no longer a collection of separate machines, but a single sustained note at a frequency you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. 1,028 motorcycles drawn from 5 chapters across 3 states had been arriving at the Ironwood compound since 1 in the morning. They had come on Rex's call, which had gone out while Harmon was still sitting on the wet gravel of the parking lot. They had come because the call described a 7-year-old boy and a dock worker who had tried to do the right thing, and a memory card that a child had carried in his shoe through a drainage pipe in 40 minutes of rain. And because these were men who understood, in the way that men understand the things they have organized their lives around, that there are moments when the machinery of legitimate authority is the problem and not the solution, and that those moments require a different kind of response. Rex had walked the senior road captains through the tactical approach in the compound parking lot at 1:15. Dock layout, gate positions, perimeter structure, the secondary loading bay, the control tower at the northeastern corner of the facility. The contractor security force estimated at between 100 and 130 equipped for the threat profile of a maritime criminal operation, which meant automatic weapons and body armor and night vision, and the confidence of people who had been in difficult circumstances and come out of them. The road captains had listened. They had asked 3 questions, all logistical. Then they had gone back to their bikes. Harlan came to the door of the medical room at 1:45. Eli was at the edge of sleep, but not across it. He opened his eyes when the door moved. "We're going to go handle something," Harlan said. "Nora's staying here. Doc Reeves is out front if you need anything." Eli looked at him. "You're going to the dock," Eli said. Harlan looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said. Eli held his gaze. "He said the people in the containers. There are people in them. I saw them when the bay door was open. 2 weeks ago when my dad took me to the port. I was supposed to be asleep in the truck, but I was awake, and when the door opened I could see inside, and there were people. Not workers, just people. Sitting." He paused. "I didn't know what it meant then, but I remembered." Harlan went very still. "You saw them," he said. "Through the window," Eli said. "The bay was lit, and the door swung open, and I could see them." Harlan looked at the boy for a long moment. The eyes that held more than they should. The watch on his wrist. The blanket around his shoulders. "We know," Harlan said. "That's part of why we're going." Eli nodded. He lay back on the cot. He said without drama in the flat, certain way he had said everything tonight, "Bring them out." Harlan held the door for a moment. "I will," he said. He pulled the door closed and went down the hallway toward the sound of the engines. In the medical room, Eli Whitfield lay under the wool blanket with his father's watch on his wrist and his right shoe on his foot, where the insole lay flat over the empty space where the card had been. He was not asleep. He listened to the engines until the sound moved far enough away that it was no longer inside the building, but outside it, not gone, just distant, moving through the dark toward the water. Then he closed his eyes all the way and held the mug against his chest and let the night carry what it was carrying and waited for morning. The sound came back before the light did. Eli had not been fully asleep at any point in the hour since Harlan left, but he had been in the suspended state that children enter when exhaustion and grief and the residual weight of the worst night of their lives reach an equilibrium. Not rest exactly, but the body's negotiated compromise between what it needs and what the mind will allow. He was aware of the room. He was aware of Doc Reeves moving quietly in the outer hallway at intervals, the creak of the old building and the wind off the water, the distant sound of Nora's voice through the wall, steady and precise the way she spoke when delivering information that needed to land correctly. He was aware of the silence where the engines had been. And then in the dark hours before 4, the silence changed. Not all at once. In increments, the way silence changes when it is being filled from a distance, A low-frequency building at the edge of perception, felt in the sternum before heard with the ears. Eli opened his eyes and lay still and listened to it come back. The sound of the engines returning from the direction of the water different now than when they had left heavier. Carrying the weight of machines that have done what they went to do, he sat up on the cot. He looked at the watch, 3:58. He waited. The night of the number 4 dock had lasted 7 minutes from the moment the lights came on to the moment the perimeter failed. Later, when the full count was made, this would strike the men who had been there as simultaneously longer and shorter than 7 minutes longer because of what happened inside it, and shorter because of how completely it ended the thing it was meant to end. But the 7 minutes were not the whole of the night. They were the loudest part of it, and loud parts have a way of making the quieter parts invisible, when in fact it is the quieter parts that do the work that lasts longest. The work before the 7 minutes was this. 19 minutes after the Ironwood compound went quiet, 1,028 motorcycles reached the outer edge of the port access road and cut their engines within a 30-second window of each other, a coordination the road captains had drilled with hand signals in the dark, because the darkness of the port's approach roads was the asset and they were not going to spend it. They rolled the last quarter mile on momentum and gravity and the slight downgrade of the access road. 1,000 machines moving through the dark without sound, which should not have been possible, and was possible because the men doing it had spent a collective several centuries on motorcycles and understood exactly what they could ask of the machines and of themselves. They held position outside the perimeter lighting's reach, 60 feet. That was the edge of the dock's security illumination, and beyond 60 feet in every direction, the dark belonged to the chapter. 11 minutes of silence. Conrad Vance's security coordinator had deployed 119 contractors across the dock's perimeter in the 20 minutes after Vance received the alert on his monitoring system at 1:29 in the morning. They were former military, most of them the specific kind that finds its way into private security work for men like Vance, who have a great deal to protect and spend generously on the protection of it. They had automatic weapons and body armor and night vision equipment calibrated for the threat profile of a maritime facility under pressure, which is to say calibrated for a threat profile that did not include what was about to happen. In those 11 minutes of silence, the network degradation Nora had built and deployed on a delayed trigger completed its function, reducing the contractor communication network to approximately 40% of operational capacity. Enough to hear, not enough to coordinate, enough to transmit, not enough to be certain the transmission had been received. At 4:04 in the morning, Harlan keyed his radio once. 1,028 sets of LED headlights came on simultaneously. The dock's exterior became something that bore no relationship to night. The combined output of 1,000 aftermarket LED arrays together produced a light event for which the dock's security infrastructure had no calibrated response, because no security infrastructure designed for a maritime facility had ever needed to account for this. The night vision equipment worn by 119 contractors, calibrated for darkness, became in the fraction of a second it took the sensors to register the input perfectly, completely, and irreversibly useless. The gate at the main entrance was a commercial steel frame unit with an electronic lock rated for vehicle impact, according to the manufacturer's specifications. Those specifications had been developed for the threat profile of vehicles driven by people who did not particularly want to damage them. Harlan Cole had spent 3 weeks in the Ironwood chapter's shop fabricating a front-end modification to his Road King that transferred the impact load from the front fork, which would have collapsed, to the frame which did not and which connected to the gate at the structural point below the electronic lock mechanism where the engineering drawings showed the frame to be weakest. The gate went sideways. The first 200 bikes came through in formation covering the dock floor and the loading areas and the approaches to the secondary bay. The remaining 828 formed the exterior perimeter in concentric arcs, covering every exit road, every service entrance, every gap between buildings that a vehicle might have used as an escape route. The dock was not surrounded. The dock had ceased to have an exterior. The contractors held for 7 minutes. This was by any arithmetic applied to the situation considerably longer than the situation warranted. 119 men with night vision that did not function, radio communication at 40% capacity, and a perimeter that had been replaced by 1,000 headlights, and the weight of 800 men who had nowhere else to be and no intention of leaving. They held because they were professionals, and professionals hold until the mathematics become undeniable. And the mathematics became undeniable at the 7-minute mark when the last section of the perimeter failed and the dock floor was no longer contested. Silas Pruitt, the Ironwood chapter's senior road captain, handled the conversations with the contractors who required more than the mathematics. He was a deliberate man, patient in the way of someone for whom patience is a tool rather than a temperament, and the conversations were brief and conclusive. The contractors sat down, all of them eventually. The ones who needed more time got more time and arrived at the same place. Harlan went into the facility. He went through the secondary bay first because of what Eli had told him in the medical room. What he found there he would not describe afterward in detail, not to anyone who had not been there, because some things are not improved by description. He found what Eli had seen through the truck window 2 weeks ago, and he understood in the direct way of a man looking at a thing without distance, not through footage or testimony, but with his own eyes. Why Dale Whitfield had spent 11 days in the dark with a camera. Why he had walked through that dock office door with the arithmetic of risk running in his head and his sister's address in an envelope in the center console of his truck. He got on his radio. He gave Rex the information. Rex called the number Nora had given him, and the people who needed to know what was in the secondary bay knew it within 4 minutes of Harlan's transmission. Then he went to find the control tower. It was at the northeastern corner of the facility, 3 stories glass and steel, the kind of structure that exists to provide a view over the entire operation. Harlan climbed the exterior stairs. The door at the top was unlocked, which told him what he needed to know about the state of mind of whoever was inside, people preparing to run. Do not think about locks. He pushed the door open. Bud Harmon was at the far console with his back to the door. He had come to the dock when Vance called him because the habit of going where the money directed him had proven stronger over 30 years than whatever calculation might have told him tonight was different. He had watched the 7 minutes from above through the glass, the lights in the perimeter and the sequence of sections failing, and he had spent the subsequent minutes at the console doing the only thing left available to him, attempting to destroy what remained to be destroyed. He had a hard drive in his hands. He was moving toward the metal trash can in the corner, which had a fire burning in it from the documents he had already fed into it when Harlan came through the door. Harmon turned. Something moved through his face that was the residue of 30 years of being the authority in every room he entered, the reflex of a man reaching for a tool he has always had and finding the shelf empty. He opened his mouth. "Don't," Harlan said. Harmon closed it. Harlan crossed the room in 4 steps and took the hard drive from Harmon's hands with a directness that did not invite participation and set it on the console away from the fire. Then he took Harmon by the collar, not the badge was already gone, left in a puddle in the Ironwood parking lot, and walked him to the window. The window was open 6 inches, propped for air circulation. Harlan looked through it at the cargo deck below. He had studied the Port Authority's engineering drawings. He had calculated the height from the control tower window to the cargo deck surface, and the containers stacked adjacent, and he knew the number, and the number was in the range that the human body, under specific conditions of landing, could survive with damage that was serious but not terminal. He had not come here to kill Bud Harmon. He had come here to do something considerably more durable than that. He looked at Harmon. The man Dale Whitfield, he said, worked this dock for 11 years. He had a 7-year-old son who was asleep in the truck tonight when you did what you did on that loading area. The boy watched it through the window. Harmon's face was doing something complicated. The reflex of authority was gone, and what was underneath it was considerably less composed. That boy, Harlan said, carried the evidence his father gave him in his shoe through a drainage pipe in 40 minutes of rain. He walked through our door and held it together long enough to tell us everything we needed to know. And then he asked us to come here. He let go of the collar. Harmon, freed from the directional pressure of Harlan's grip, made the instinctive choice of a man whose options have collapsed to movement and moved toward the door. He did not reach the door. What he reached was the window because Harlan had anticipated the direction and was faster and had the advantage of someone who had calculated this room from the doorway before he came through it. Harman went through the open window in the involuntary manner of something redirected by a force it cannot contest, and arrived at the cargo deck below with a sound that was substantial and unambiguous. Harlan looked through the window. Harman was against the side of a container not still making noise, which indicated structural damage of the non-fatal variety. He looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man checking a calculation and finding it correct. Then he turned around. Conrad Vance was against the far wall. His suit was immaculate. This was what Harlan noticed first, the way you notice certain details when the mind is operating at a high pitch. The suit was expensive and had survived everything the last several hours contained, and was still immaculate, which was somehow the most complete summary of the man wearing it that Harlan could have constructed. The suit had outlasted the empire it was dressed for. Vance himself had not. The person inside it was against the wall in the way of someone who has watched everything he built disassemble itself on the monitors in front of him over the course of a single night, and has arrived at the place past fear that exists when there is nothing left to be afraid of losing because the losing is complete. He had watched the 7 minutes from above. He had watched the contractor perimeter fail. He had watched the secondary bay be opened by the men Harlan sent in. He had watched the dock floor as the operation he had spent 14 months constructing ceased to be an operation and became a crime scene. Harlan reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the memory card. Dale Whitfield's card, the one Eli had carried in his shoe, the one Nora had copied and transmitted and distributed, and which now existed in 14 separate locations, including the servers of the federal task force that was going to arrive at this dock in 11 minutes. He walked across the control room and placed it on the console in front of Vance with a deliberateness that was not gentleness, but its opposite. The care of someone placing something in a position from which it cannot be ignored. Your dock, Harlan said. Your ships, your operation. He looked at Vance directly. A dock worker named Dale Whitfield recorded all of it, Harlan said, because he believed the truth was worth the cost of delivering it. He let that sit. He was right. Vance looked at the monitors. He looked at the card. He looked at Harlan. And then he did something Harlan had not anticipated and would think about afterward with a kind of bleak precision. He sat down. Not the collapse of someone whose legs have failed, the deliberate sitting down of someone who has finished with standing. He sat in the operator's chair in front of the console and put his hands flat on the surface beside the card and looked at the monitors showing the dock floor below. The men moving through it, the federal vehicles just now appearing at the main gate with their lights going, and he said nothing at all. There was nothing left in him that had anything to say. Harlan looked at him for a moment. Then he turned and walked out of the control tower and down the exterior stairs and onto the dock floor where the morning was beginning to arrive in the gray increments of a coastal October dawn. The light coming up over the water and finding the chrome and the leather and the 100-odd contractors sitting in ordered groups on the dock surface and the road captains moving among them with the efficiency of men who have done what they came to do and are managing the transition to what comes next. The federal task force arrived at 4:17 in the morning. They arrived with the personnel and the warrants and the organizational readiness of a team that has received a complete evidentiary package at 1:27 in the morning and has spent the subsequent 2 hours and 50 minutes converting that package into action. Nora's work had done what she designed it to do. The task force did not arrive to assess a situation. They arrived to execute one. The dock was secured. The containers were inventoried. The secondary bay was processed by the federal personnel whose function it was to process such things, and the people inside it, who had been there in the darkness of being cargo in the hold of Conrad Vance's operation, were brought out into the gray coastal dawn and attended to by the medical units that the task force had brought because Nora had told the federal contact at 1:40 in the morning exactly what he would need, and he had listened. Vance was taken from the control tower. He did not resist. He had finished with resistance somewhere between the moment the lights came on and the moment he sat down in the operator's chair. Harmon was located on the cargo deck. He required medical attention. He received it. The records that Vance's people had spent the preceding hours attempting to destroy had been largely preserved because of something Dale Whitfield had done 3 days before the meeting with Clete Odom. He had uploaded the complete footage archive to a personal cloud storage account, working alone at his kitchen table on Cutter Street, using an email address he had created specifically for this purpose. He had written the credential, the address, and the password on a small piece of paper and tucked it into the stitched lining of his dock jacket. The heavy one, the one he had left across the passenger seat for Eli to find in the dark. The Federal Evidence Inventory had logged the paper as personal effects standard processing. Nora had requested the full effects manifest at 5:08 in the morning. She found the credential in under 4 minutes because she had been looking for exactly this kind of thing, because Dale Whitfield was the kind of man who prepared for the version of events where he did not walk back out, and she had understood this about him from the first minute she watched his footage. She accessed the cloud account remotely, confirmed the archive was intact across all 11 days of recording, and transmitted the access credentials to the task force's digital evidence team with a cover note establishing the chain of custody in the precise legal format required to make it admissible. The chain was unbroken. Dale Whitfield had understood without legal training, without anyone telling him that the evidence needed to be preserved in a way that would survive him. He had been right about that, the same way he had been right about everything else. At 5:43 in the morning, the first of the affiliate chapter's bikes began leaving the dock. They went in the order they had arrived, the furthest chapters first, the ones with the longest roads back. They went without ceremony, which was itself a kind of ceremony, the dignity of men who did what was needed and left without requiring anything from the leaving. Harlan rode back to the compound in the gray dawn with the water to his left and the road empty in front of him, and the quiet of a man who has done something that needed doing and is now in the moment after it, where the doing is finished, and what remains is everything the doing was for. He was thinking about a 7-year-old boy on a cot with a wool blanket and a cold mug and a watch on his wrist. Eli was awake when Harlan came through the door of the medical room. He had been awake since the engines changed, since the quality of the darkness outside the small window shifted from night to the gray edge of morning. He was sitting up with the blanket around his shoulders and the mug in his hands, and he looked at Harlan when the door opened with eyes that had been waiting for this moment with a patience that exceeded what 7 years old was supposed to contain. Harlan sat down across from him. "The people in the containers," Eli said. "They're out," Harlan said. "They're being taken care of." Eli looked at him for a moment. Then he looked down at the mug. He nodded once with the slow gravity of someone receiving information they needed badly and had not allowed themselves to expect. "And the bad men," he said. Harlan looked at him directly. "The government has them now," he said. "Vance and Harmon, both. They're not going to be in a position to hurt anyone else." Eli was quiet. He turned the mug in his hands. He looked at the watch. "My dad knew this might happen," Eli said. "It wasn't a question. He planned for it. That's why the jacket was on the seat. That's why the card was in the pocket." Harlan considered what to say and decided the truth was the only thing available. "Yes," he said. "Your dad was the kind of man who looks at a hard situation and makes sure the people he loves are going to be okay on the other side of it, whatever it cost him." Eli looked at the watch for a long moment. He had the expression of a child working through something that is too large for the available vocabulary and has decided to carry it without the words. "He would have liked you," Eli said. Harlan held the boy's gaze. "Yeah," he said. "I know he would have." They buried Dale Whitfield on a Wednesday in the municipal cemetery on the east side of Harwick, in a section that caught the morning light and was surrounded in October by trees that had gone red and yellow and were dropping their leaves in the unhurried way of things that have completed what they came to do. The service was held in the small Presbyterian church on Kellerman Street, where Dale had taken Eli twice at Christmas and at Easter, not from strong conviction but from the instinct of a father who wanted his son to have the experience of being in a room where people were trying to be good to each other. More people came than the church could hold. The overflow stood on the steps and along the sidewalk, and the service was piped through speakers that someone from the chapter had set up on the church's small porch the night before without being asked. Dock workers mostly and their families people who had worked alongside Dale for years and whose grief had the practical weight of those who have lost someone they counted on. Foremen and shift supervisors and the man who ran the commissary truck and who had been making Dale's coffee order black no sugar for 9 years without needing to be told. Clete Odom was there. He stood at the back and did not speak to anyone. He had spent the 48 hours after the dock in conversation with the federal task force that had clarified a number of things about the night of the meeting. The call he had received 3 hours before Dale arrived, the nature of the pressure that had been applied to him over the preceding 2 years. The clarification had not absolved him of anything. He understood this. He stood at the back of the church for the full duration and did not leave before it was over, which was the only thing he had left to offer. The chapter came to the graveside. Not all of them. 1,000 men at a graveside is a different event than the one it is supposed to be. But a contingent 30 of the Ironwood chapter, including Rex and Harlan and Silas, and representatives from each of the 4 affiliate chapters, and they came without their cuts and without their steel because this part was not that occasion. They stood at the back and were quiet and stayed until the last word was said and the last handful of dirt had fallen. Margaret Whitfield had driven 8 hours from Chillicothe, Ohio, arriving the night before the service. She was 49 slight with Dale's coloring and the exhausted composure of someone who has received the worst news of her life and spent the drive down converting the shock of it into the practical determination of someone who understands that something is now required of her. She had not known about Eli. Dale had meant to call. She understood. From the envelope she found in the center console of his truck, when the authorities released the vehicle, that he had meant many things and had not always found the time for them, and had in the end trusted that she would know what to do. The note was 3 sentences, her name at the top. Then his name is Eli. He's 7. Then I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. Then at the bottom, without further explanation, because Dale had known his sister for 49 years and trusted her in the way of someone who has watched a person be themselves across a lifetime of circumstances and found them sufficient, thank you. Margaret had read the note in the parking lot of the police impound where she collected the truck and had sat with it for a long time before she drove to where Eli was staying. She had her hand on Eli's shoulder throughout the service. Eli, who had in the past week demonstrated a capacity for composure that exceeded what his age was supposed to allow, held it together through the service and through the graveside and through the part afterward where people came and said things to him, and he nodded at each of them with the gravity of a child who understands that the things people say at these moments are not for him but for themselves, and that the correct response is to receive them. He held it together until the crowd thinned, and he found himself near the chapter's contingent at the edge of the cemetery, and then he walked to Harlan and put his arms around as much of Harlan as his 7-year-old arms could reach, which was the middle, and held on. Harlan put his hand on the back of the boy's head. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying that was not already being said by everything else. Rex had established the fund the previous day. He had handled it personally with Nora's documentation so that it was structured correctly, a formal trust with independent oversight, not a collection, not a gesture, but a permanent instrument. $840,000 from the Ironwood chapter's operational reserves, with commitments from each of the 4 affiliate chapters that brought the total to $2,300,000 designated for Eli's education, his housing with Margaret in Chillicothe, and his security across whatever he needed to become, whoever he was going to be. The fund was administered by Nora and by an attorney in Columbus, whom she had vetted personally and trusted professionally, and it would be there for as long as Eli needed it to be there, which was the point of building it correctly. There was also the matter of the dock, the number 4 dock, and the 3 adjacent ones that the federal investigation had subsequently determined were part of the same operational structure. They were sealed pending the investigation, which was going to be long and procedurally complex, and would involve multiple jurisdictions and a great deal of the unglamorous work that actual accountability requires. Nora was monitoring it. She had made introductions to the federal team that would ensure Dale Whitfield's footage remained central to the evidentiary record, rather than peripheral to a broader case that might bury the specific human truth of it in the aggregate legal machinery. Rex had also made a call to the state attorney general's office, not the local office, which was in the process of its own examination, but the state-level office 2 days after the dock. The call had been returned. The conversation had been useful in the way of conversations between people who both understand that something needs to happen and have complementary capacities for making it happen. The reconstruction of the Harwich Police Department's command structure was going to be a different kind of work than the dock's slower, more contested with more people who had reasons to resist it. But it was going to happen. None of this was the end of something. It was the beginning of the long, procedurally unsatisfying work of actual justice, which does not arrive complete and does not arrive clean and does not arrive at the moment of highest pitch, but accumulates slowly in courtrooms and in filings and in the quiet decisions of people who can either do the right thing or not. But some things were the end of something. Vance Shipping was finished as an operating entity. The holding structure was frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. Harmon would not carry a badge again. The people who had been in those containers were receiving the appropriate assistance which Eli had asked Harlan about specifically, and to which Harlan had given the honest answer that they were being taken care of, which was not everything, but was true. On the Saturday after the service, 4 days before Margaret drove Eli north to begin the process of rebuilding things, Harlan came to the house on Kellerman Street where Eli was staying and knocked on the door and came in with something wrapped in a cloth under his arm. He set it on the kitchen table and folded back the cloth. It was a cut. Leather, the real kind, the kind that takes a craftsman to work correctly sized down for a 7-year-old, with adjustments for the fact that the 7-year-old in question was small for his age and would not remain 7. The Ironwood chapter patch was on the back, the full patch, the same configuration that full members wore. The bottom rocker, where the chapter location would normally appear, read simply, Little Brother. Rex had designed it and had it made by the woman in Dunmore who did the chapter's leatherwork, and she had done it in 3 days without charging for the rush because Rex had explained what it was for. Eli looked at it on the table. He looked at Harlan. He picked it up and put it on over his shirt, the way he had seen the men in the clubhouse wear theirs, with the directness of a child who does not perform things, but simply does them. It was slightly large because she had made it with room to grow, which was the correct decision. He stood in it and looked at Harlan. Is it mine, he said. It's yours, Harlan said. You earned it. Eli looked down at it. He ran his hand along the patch on the back, slowly feeling the stitching. He looked up at Harlan with eyes that held something that had not been there a week ago and was not going to leave something deposited over the course of a week that no 7-year-old should have been required to live through, and that had nonetheless made him in some specific and permanent way more than he had been before it. My dad would have liked you, he said. Harlan looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at things that are true and cost something to receive. Yeah, he said quietly. I know he would have. On Sunday morning, before Margaret's car was packed, the chapter assembled in the street outside the house on Kellerman Street. Not 1,000. Harwich's residential streets were built for families and deliveries, and the modest traffic of a port city's east side not for 1,000 motorcycles. But the Ironwood chapter, all of them, and the road captains from each of the 4 affiliates who had stayed on through the week, and a number of members who had no formal reason to stay, except that they had their own reasons for wanting to be present for this part. 51 bikes, both sides of the street. Engines running, not loud idling, held in restraint, which is a different sound from any other sound a motorcycle makes. Not the full voice of the thing, but the suggestion of it. The quiet presence of a power choosing for this moment to be still. Eli came out of the house at 7:40 in the morning with his bag over his shoulder and his cut-on over his jacket, the new one Margaret had bought him in Harwich before the service, dark green, like the one Dale had always worn. He stopped on the sidewalk. He looked at the 2 rows of bikes and the men beside them, and the 51 sets of eyes that were looking back at him. Harlan was at the near end of the street. He looked at Eli. He nodded once, the nod that in this company means more than acknowledgement. That means I see you and I know what it cost, and you are not alone in carrying it. Eli straightened his spine. He walked. He walked down the center of the street between the 2 rows, and as he passed each bike, the rider beside it raised a fist. Not aggression, not performance. The closed fist that means solidarity and recognition. I was here for this, and I will not forget it. Each rider held it there, arm raised until Eli had passed, and did not lower it until he was gone. So that for the full length of the street, Eli walked between two rows of raised fists, and the sound of 51 engines, and the October light coming down Kellerman Street, and catching the chrome and the leather in the faces of men who had no conventional claim to being the people you called when the world came apart beneath you, and who had been, by every measure that had mattered this week, exactly that. He walked the full length of the street. At the end, he stopped and turned around. 51 fists in the morning air, 51 engines running, the light moving on chrome and leather, and the faces of men who had ridden through the dark toward the water because a 7-year-old boy had walked through a door and held on and trusted them with the most important thing he had. Eli raised his own fist. The engines lifted, not to full throttle, not the full voice, just enough. Enough to fill Kellerman Street and the morning and the space in the boy's chest where something had broken a week ago and was not healed, would not be healed for a long time, but was being held carefully and completely by everything assembled in this street until the healing could begin. Margaret put her hand on his shoulder. He did not look away from the street. He kept his fist raised until the last rider lowered his. Then he let his arm down. He took a breath. He looked at Margaret, who had her brother's steadiness and who had driven 8 hours without hesitation when a phone call told her a child needed her because she was the kind of person Dale had always known she was. "Okay," Eli said. To nobody in particular, or to everybody, or to his father, who had given him a watch that morning and told him he was old enough for one, and had been right about that the same way he had been right about everything else. Okay. They walked to the car. Margaret put the bag in the back. Eli got in the passenger seat and buckled his belt and looked out the window at the street as they pulled away at the 2 rows of bikes beginning to ease forward at Harlan, standing at the near end, watching the car go at the morning light on all of it. They drove north on the highway, and behind them, the sound of the engines filled the on-ramp and the overpass, in the first mile of open road following them, farther than sound should follow the way. Large things leave a presence after they are gone, until the highway curved west and the city fell behind them, and the October countryside opened up in front of them, the red and yellow of the trees along the roadway. The American landscape of a morning that continues regardless of what the night before it contained. Eli looked at the road ahead. He looked at the watch on his wrist. He looked at the ironwood patch on his cut, and at the bottom rocker he knew was there, even when he could not see it from this angle. Little brother. He turned back to the window and watched the trees go past the red and the yellow of them in the morning light and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, because his father had said everything that needed saying 3 weeks ago. When he had stood in the corridor shadow and watched what he was not supposed to see, and understood what it was going to cost, and decided that the cost was one he was going to pay. The truth is worth something. That was what Dale Whitfield had decided. The truth is worth something, and I am going to be the one who proves it. He had been right. The truth had been worth exactly what he said it was worth. It had been worth everything. And the everything it had been worth was riding north in the passenger seat of his sister's car, wearing a watch and a leather cut, and eyes that had paid for what they knew and were going to spend the rest of their life knowing it, carrying the precise weight of a father who had trusted his son with the most important thing he had and had not been wrong to trust him. The highway opened. The trees went past. The morning continued north.